He smirked and said, "No one will believe you." I still remember the way he leaned back in his chair, completely confident that he was untouchable. My son's teacher, a man entrusted with shaping young minds, had failed him on purpose, all because I refused to give in to his disgusting advances. He thought he had all the power, thought that his reputation would protect him, thought that no one would take my word over his. But what he didn't know was that I had recorded everything. And when I walked into that school board meeting and pressed play, his entire world came crashing down. I always taught my son that hard work pays off, that if he studied and did his best, he would succeed, just like I had always believed when I was growing up. So when he came home one day with a failing grade on a project he had worked on for weeks, I was completely shocked and confused because he had been so confident about it just the day before. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe a simple grading error or even a misunderstanding, but then I saw the look on his face, defeated, confused, hurt, and that was when I knew this wasn't just a bad grade. It was something more. "Mom, I don't get it," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he handed me the paper with the big, red F scrawled across it. I followed all the instructions exactly. I even stayed after school for extra help. That was the first moment I realized something wasn't right, and a strange uneasiness settled in my stomach like a heavy weight I couldn't shake. Determined to get answers, I decided to email his teacher, Mr. Reynolds, a man who had always seemed professional, if not a little too friendly at times, but I never thought much of it before. His response came almost immediately, almost too fast, as if he had been expecting me to reach out, and instead of offering an explanation over email, he asked me to meet him in person after school to discuss the matter privately. His wording made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain, but I brushed it off, convincing myself that maybe he just wanted to go over my son's work in detail, maybe even allow him to redo the project. I never expected what actually happened next. When I arrived at his classroom, he greeted me with a smile that was a little too wide, his posture relaxed, but there was something unsettling in his demeanor, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He gestured for me to come inside, then, without hesitation, shut the door behind me, the sound of the latch clicking into place, making the hairs on my arms stand up. "Your son is struggling," he said, leaning against his desk, his tone casual, almost too casual, as if we were discussing the weather instead of my child's education. "But I'm sure we can work something out if you're willing to be flexible." His eyes lingered on me in a way that made my skin crawl, and for a second, I was too stunned to react, my brain struggling to piece together what he was actually implying. When I instinctively took a step back, his smile disappeared, replaced by something colder, something dangerous. "Think carefully," he said, his voice lowering ever so slightly, his eyes darkening. "Because if you say no, things might get difficult for your son." I felt sick as I left that classroom, his words ringing in my ears like an unbearable echo, but I told myself that maybe, just maybe, I had misunderstood the situation, that I was overthinking things, that there had to be another explanation for what had just happened. I tried to push the interaction out of my mind, telling myself that I was being paranoid, that no teacher, no grown man, would actually sabotage a child's education just because his mother rejected his inappropriate advances. But when my son came home the next week with another failed assignment, despite his confidence that he had done everything right, despite the fact that he had checked and double-checked his work, I knew right then and there that this was no longer just a suspicion. It was deliberate. I tried to remain calm, tried to reassure my son that we would fix this, but the truth was, I had no idea how. If Mr. Reynolds was actually punishing my child out of spite, I needed to take action. So I did the most logical thing. I requested a formal meeting with the principal, hoping that once I explained the situation, she would take my concerns seriously and investigate the matter properly. But the moment I walked into that office, the moment I saw Mr. Reynolds sitting there, his expression neutral but too composed, I knew I had walked straight into a trap. He had been prepared for this, had anticipated my next move, had made sure that whatever I said would sound like nothing more than the ramblings of an overprotective mother who didn't want to accept that her son wasn't doing well in school. The principal started the meeting with a polite but dismissive tone, thanking me for coming in before handing me a folder with copies of my son's assignments, each one filled with vague, unprovable criticisms, phrases like lacks effort, did not meet expectations, and failed to follow the rubric scrawled in the margins in red ink. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, recognizing my son's handwriting, recognizing the work he had poured his heart into, the same work he had excitedly told me about just days before, only to now be told it wasn't good enough. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm as I turned to Mr. Reynolds, watching the way he sat there so smugly, so sure of himself, so untouchable. "I don't understand," I said carefully, my fingers tightening around the paper in my hands. "He worked hard on these assignments. He followed the instructions exactly. Why did he fail?" Mr. Reynolds barely blinked, barely reacted, instead leaning forward with the same carefully measured expression he had worn the last time I confronted him, as if he had already rehearsed exactly what he was going to say. "I understand your concern," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with false professionalism, "but unfortunately, your son's work did not meet the required standards. I know it's disappointing, but sometimes students struggle more than they realize, and it's important for them to learn from their mistakes." His tone was calm, logical, almost reasonable, and for a split second, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I was imagining all of this, if maybe I was being too defensive, if maybe I was letting my own emotions cloud my judgment. But then I saw it. The barely there twitch at the corner of his mouth, the slightest hint of amusement in his eyes, like he was enjoying this, like he was waiting to see if I would catch on. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral, to not let him see the way my blood was boiling beneath my skin. "I'd like to go over his assignments with you in more detail," I said, keeping my voice steady, refusing to let him intimidate me, refusing to let him win. "I want to understand exactly what he did wrong so we can work on it together." But before Mr. Reynolds could respond, the principal cleared her throat and interjected, her voice polite but firm, like she was already growing tired of the conversation. "I understand your frustration, but Mr. Reynolds is one of our most respected teachers," she said, her words final, "and I trust his judgment completely. I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do at this time." And that was when it hit me. He knew no one would believe me. He was counting on it, had planned for it, had carefully constructed this entire scenario in a way that made it impossible for me to fight back without looking irrational, emotional, or worse, like I was making false accusations just because I didn't like the grades my son was receiving. I looked at the principal, at the way she barely glanced at the papers in front of her, at the way she had already decided before I even walked in that this meeting was nothing more than a formality, at the way she had already taken Mr. Reynolds' side without even considering the possibility that something deeper was going on. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, a mixture of fury and frustration burning through me as I realized exactly what kind of battle I was up against. I had walked into this meeting expecting fairness, expecting someone to listen, expecting justice. But I wasn't going to get any of those things. Not with the way Mr. Reynolds had set everything up so perfectly, not with the way he had anticipated my every move, not with the way he had positioned himself as the trusted educator and me as nothing more than a hysterical mother. But if he thought I was going to walk away defeated, if he thought I was just going to accept this and let him get away with it, then he had gravely underestimated me. I could have walked away from the situation entirely, could have pulled my son out of Mr. Reynolds' class, could have demanded that he be reassigned to another teacher, but I knew that wouldn't truly solve the problem, and I refused to let this man think that he had won. This wasn't just about one grade or one student. This was about a man who had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that he could manipulate situations to his advantage, that he could punish a child simply because his mother had the audacity to reject him. I knew that if I didn't fight back, he would continue doing this, that I wouldn't be the first or the last person to suffer under his abuse of power, and that thought made my blood boil. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my son's failed assignments, my hands clenched into fists, I realized that playing by the rules wasn't going to work, that logic and reasoning had already failed me, that going through the proper channels was pointless because the system was built to protect men like him. If Mr. Reynolds thought he was safe, if he thought that no one would believe me, if he thought he could continue using his position to bully and manipulate, then he was about to learn just how wrong he was. That was when I did what I should have done much earlier. I set up a hidden camera, a small, discreet device that wouldn't be noticed, something that would capture everything without his knowledge. If he was going to hide behind his reputation, if he was going to rely on other people's trust to cover his tracks, then I was going to take that trust and shatter it with the one thing he wouldn't be able to manipulate: cold, hard proof. The next morning, I sent him an email, carefully crafting my words to sound concerned rather than confrontational, telling him that I had been thinking about our previous conversation and wanted to meet with him again. I made it sound like I was feeling desperate, like I was starting to reconsider, like I was willing to negotiate if it meant helping my son. I knew that if I played my part correctly, if I let him believe that I was on the verge of giving in, he would take the bait, and just as I expected, his response came within minutes, his message dripping with fake sympathy, inviting me to meet with him in his classroom alone later that afternoon. I walked into that meeting with my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse hammering so loudly that I could barely hear my own thoughts, but I forced myself to remain calm, to pretend that I wasn't about to record something that could ruin his entire career. Mr. Reynolds greeted me with that same smug smile, the same too friendly demeanor, but this time, now that I knew exactly what he was, now that I understood what he was capable of, it didn't feel charming or professional. It felt predatory. He gestured for me to take a seat, leaning casually against his desk, watching me with eyes that held too much amusement, as if he had already won, as if he had already broken me down enough to make me submit. "I'm really glad you came to your senses," he said, his voice smooth, his words carefully measured, his tone deliberately condescending. "I know you were upset before, but I think we can find a way to fix things." I nodded slowly, keeping my hands folded in my lap to hide the way they were trembling, making sure the hidden camera inside my purse was angled just right, capturing every word, every movement, every sleazy little smirk that crossed his face. I tilted my head slightly, making my expression appear hesitant, as if I were struggling with my own morals, as if I were considering the very idea that he had presented to me before. "I just don't understand why my son is struggling so much in your class," I said carefully, keeping my voice soft, making it sound like I was on the verge of giving in. "I mean, I know he's not perfect, but I thought he was doing better. Is there really no way to fix this?" I let the words trail off deliberately, giving him the perfect opening to show his true colors, and the way his smirk widened told me that he had completely taken the bait. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if we were discussing something secret, something forbidden, something that could never be spoken about too loudly. "You're a smart woman," he said, his voice smooth, his eyes flickering over me in a way that made my stomach twist. "You know how things work. Sometimes, when you want something, you have to be willing to compromise." His fingers tapped against his desk, his gaze locked onto mine, his confidence practically radiating off of him. He was so sure of himself, so convinced that I wouldn't dare to call him out, so certain that I would be too afraid to fight back. "Compromise?" I repeated, tilting my head slightly, pretending to be confused, pretending that I needed him to explain, pretending that I wasn't already recording every word coming out of his mouth. "You scratch my back, I scratch yours," he said, shrugging casually, as if he weren't suggesting something completely disgusting, as if he weren't abusing his power right in front of me. "Help me out, and I'll make sure your son gets the grades he deserves." His voice was light, easy, confident, and when I didn't immediately react, his smirk grew. "Of course, if you're not interested, I totally understand. It's just a shame, really. He's such a bright kid. I'd hate to see him struggle so much because of something that could have been avoided." And there it was. The threat. I inhaled slowly, forcing my expression to remain neutral, forcing my stomach to settle despite the rage boiling beneath the surface, forcing myself to stay in character just a little longer. "I see," I murmured, nodding slightly, making it look like I was considering his offer, making it seem like I was finally breaking the way he wanted me to. Then, just as he leaned in slightly, just as he prepared to seal the deal, I smiled and reached for my purse, casually flipping it open. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," I said, my voice light, my tone just a little too amused. "You've just made everything so much easier for me." The shift in his expression was instantaneous. His smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly as confusion flickered across his face, as he tried to make sense of the sudden shift in my demeanor. "What?" he asked, his tone uncertain for the first time. I stood up, slinging my purse over my shoulder, making sure the camera was still angled perfectly as I looked him straight in the eye. "You'll see soon enough," I said smoothly before turning and walking out of the classroom, leaving him sitting there in stunned silence, completely unaware that his entire world was about to come crashing down around him. Mr. Reynolds leaned in closer than necessary, his voice dropping to a low, suggestive murmur, as if the walls of the classroom had ears, as if he knew what he was saying was wrong but assumed he could get away with it. "I can make this go away," he said smoothly, his words slow and deliberate, his eyes locked onto mine with a confidence that made my skin crawl. "Your son doesn't have to fail. You just have to be reasonable." He was so self-assured, so completely convinced that I would fold under the weight of his implied threat, so certain that I wouldn't dare to fight back, that I would just accept the situation he was forcing upon me. I kept my expression neutral, careful not to let the disgust and rage boiling inside me show, careful to keep my voice steady as I tilted my head slightly and asked, "What exactly do you mean by that?" I played my role perfectly, pretending to be confused, pretending to hesitate, pretending to consider his words, all while the small, discreet camera inside my purse captured every vile syllable that left his mouth. His smirk widened at my supposed naivety, at my apparent willingness to entertain his suggestion, at the false vulnerability I was presenting to him on a silver platter. "Don't act like you don't know," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk in a slow, rhythmic pattern. "A little appreciation goes a long way." He reached for my hand then, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that made my stomach twist with revulsion. And that was it. The moment I knew I had everything I needed. The moment I knew there was no way he could talk his way out of this. The moment I knew he had just sealed his own fate. I stood up abruptly, yanking my hand away before he could make contact, grabbing my purse with steady hands, forcing myself to stay composed despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, could feel the tension in the air shift as he registered my sudden change in demeanor, as he sensed that something was off, that I was no longer playing the role he had expected me to. His smirk faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing in suspicion, but before he could open his mouth to question me, I smiled, a slow, deliberate, knowing smile, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. You've just made everything so much easier for me." The confusion in his eyes was almost satisfying, the way his posture stiffened ever so slightly, the way his fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to reach for something, maybe his phone, maybe the door, maybe the confidence he had just lost. "What?" he asked, his voice losing its previous smoothness, replaced by something sharper, something laced with unease. I took my time adjusting my purse strap, making sure the camera was safely secured, making sure I had every last piece of evidence I needed before meeting his gaze again. "You'll see soon enough," I said lightly, my tone calm, controlled, unwavering. And then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the classroom, leaving him sitting there in stunned silence, completely unaware that his entire world was about to collapse around him. When I sent the footage to the principal that night, I didn't get a response right away, no immediate outrage, no call for a meeting, no acknowledgement that she had even seen what I'd sent her. For a moment, a sickening worry settled in my stomach. What if they ignored it? What if they covered for him? What if they buried this the same way they had dismissed my concerns before? The thought of him getting away with it, of my son continuing to suffer under his control, of other mothers possibly facing the same nightmare without knowing what he was capable of, made my blood run cold. But the next morning, just as I was dropping my son off at school, my phone buzzed with a call from the district office. The woman on the other end, her voice crisp and professional but carrying an unmistakable tension, informed me that the school board had reviewed my complaint and that I was to attend an urgent meeting that afternoon. There was no room for debate, no option to reschedule, just a firm instruction: be there. I knew in that moment that the footage had done exactly what I needed it to do. When I arrived at the school board's office later that day, I expected to wait, expected to be dismissed or questioned or even subtly intimidated into dropping the matter. But instead, I was ushered into a large conference room almost immediately, and there, sitting at the long table, was the principal, two senior members of the district's administration, a legal representative, and, most satisfyingly, Mr. Reynolds himself. But this time, he wasn't smirking. He sat rigid in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together, his normally confident posture stiff and uncomfortable, his face pale in a way that told me he already knew he was in trouble. The arrogance he had worn so effortlessly before, the smug condescension that had dripped from every word he spoke to me, was gone now, replaced with something that almost looked like panic. The principal cleared her throat, adjusting the papers in front of her before reaching for a small tablet, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. "We've reviewed the recording you sent us," she said, her voice firm, her tone carrying none of the dismissiveness she had shown me before. "We'll be playing it now for the record." She tapped the screen, and suddenly, the room was filled with his voice, clear, undeniable, disgusting. "I can make this go away. You just have to be reasonable." The words, so casual when he had spoken them, so effortlessly slimy, now rang out like a death sentence. I kept my eyes locked on his face, watching as his fingers twitched, as his throat bobbed with a nervous swallow, as his entire body stiffened with every passing second of his own voice condemning him. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was thick, the weight of what had just been played hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. One of the board members exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple before speaking in a low, controlled voice. "Mr. Reynolds, do you have anything to say for yourself?" For the first time since I had met him, Mr. Reynolds was speechless. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to speak, as if he was scrambling for an excuse, for a defense, for anything that could get him out of this mess. But there was nothing he could say, no twisted version of events he could fabricate, no lie that could erase what had just been played out loud for everyone to hear. He had spent so much time believing that he was untouchable, that no one would believe me, that his reputation would always protect him, and now, he was watching as that very reputation crumbled before his eyes. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting on the table, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I smirked at him. The principal looked horrified, her normally composed expression faltering as she shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together on the table in front of her. The members of the school board exchanged uneasy glances, whispering in low voices, shaking their heads, clearly processing the weight of what they had just heard, realizing that this wasn't just a small incident that could be brushed under the rug. Finally, after several agonizing moments of silence, one of the board members, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes, cleared his throat and turned his full attention to me, his voice heavy with something that almost sounded like genuine regret. "We are so sorry," he said carefully, his words deliberate, his tone full of something that could have been sympathy or maybe just damage control. "This is unacceptable. He will be placed on immediate leave while we investigate further." I barely reacted, barely acknowledged his attempt at professionalism, barely let myself feel anything as I turned my attention toward Mr. Reynolds, who, for the first time since this entire nightmare began, looked afraid. The sweat beaded along his forehead, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching, his once smug expression now replaced with something closer to sheer panic. His eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, searching for an escape, searching for a way to regain control, searching for someone, anyone, to step in and save him from the situation he had created for himself. But it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Without breaking eye contact, without letting my satisfaction show too soon, I calmly reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, the weight of it heavy between my fingers, the final nail in his coffin. I slid it across the table, my movements slow and deliberate, my face unreadable as I watched his eyes flicker down toward it, his throat bobbing as he swallowed thickly. "That's a copy of my formal complaint to the State Education Board," I said evenly, my voice steady, my words carrying the exact kind of finality that told him there was no way out of this. "Then, just for good measure," I added, "oh, and my lawyer will be in touch soon." He finally lost it then, his mask slipping completely, his carefully constructed composure crumbling right in front of everyone, his face twisting into something desperate and panicked and truly pathetic. His hands clenched into fists on the table, his breath coming out uneven, his confidence shattered beyond repair. "Please," he muttered, his voice lower now, more frantic, his entire body tense, as if he was barely holding himself together. "We can work something out." I could feel the weight of the entire room watching us, could feel the way the principal and the board members stiffened at his words, could feel the undeniable shift that had just happened. He had gone from respected teacher to disgraced predator in the span of a few minutes, from someone who had once thought he was invincible to someone begging for a second chance. But I wasn't going to give him that luxury, wasn't going to let him rewrite the narrative, wasn't going to let him worm his way out of the consequences he had spent so long believing would never touch him. I leaned forward slightly, just enough for him to hear me clearly, just enough to let him feel it, and with a slow, deliberate smirk, I whispered the words that I knew would break him. "That's what you said to me, remember?" The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, filled with the kind of tension that made every single person in that room hold their breath, made every single witness realize that they had just watched something irreversible happen. Mr. Reynolds recoiled slightly, as if the words had physically hurt him, his face paling even more, his fingers twitching like he wanted to lash out, like he wanted to scream, like he finally understood that there was no coming back from this. And as I sat there, my hands folded neatly on the table, my expression calm and composed, I realized something important. He had spent so much time believing that he was the one holding all the power, so much time thinking that he could intimidate and manipulate without consequence, so much time playing his little game without ever considering that he might lose. But in the end, he was the one who lost everything. Mr. Reynolds was fired within days of the school board meeting, his carefully built reputation crumbling around him faster than he had ever imagined possible, his smug confidence now nothing more than a distant memory. The school sent out an official statement, carefully worded and drenched in public relations jargon, apologizing for the misconduct of a former teacher, as if reducing his actions to a simple misconduct could erase what he had done, as if calling it anything less than predatory abuse of power could somehow soften the truth. They assured parents that they were reviewing their policies, that they were committed to maintaining a safe environment for students and staff, that this was an isolated incident, but I knew better than to believe their carefully constructed damage control. I knew that a man like Mr. Reynolds didn't just wake up one day and decide to start preying on someone, didn't just suddenly develop a taste for manipulation and coercion, didn't just accidentally abuse his authority to punish a child because his mother dared to tell him no. I knew that men like him operated in patterns, that they tested the waters with small acts of control before escalating, that they thrived in environments where their behavior was overlooked, dismissed, or, worse, enabled. And I knew, deep in my gut, that I couldn't have been the first person he had done this to, that my son wasn't the only student he had targeted, that this entire situation had likely been building for years without anyone noticing. So I made sure everyone knew what he had done, made sure that this wouldn't just disappear into whispered rumors and half-forgotten gossip, made sure that no one could ever claim ignorance about the kind of man he truly was. I spoke to parents at school drop-offs. I shared my story online in local community groups. I reached out to former students, former teachers, anyone who might have crossed paths with him over the years. And then, something incredible happened. Other women, other mothers, began stepping forward, their voices trembling with the weight of their own experiences, their stories eerily similar to mine. One mother told me about how Mr. Reynolds had failed her daughter on multiple assignments, making vague claims that she wasn't applying herself, refusing to provide clear feedback, punishing her with grades that didn't match her effort. Another woman admitted that she had once gotten a strange feeling about him, that he had made inappropriate comments about her appearance during a parent-teacher conference, that she had dismissed it at the time because she didn't want to overreact. A former student, now in college, messaged me privately to say that she had always felt uncomfortable around him but had never been able to explain why, that she had witnessed the way he treated certain female students differently, that she had always suspected something was off about him. One by one, the stories poured in, painting a picture far darker than I had even imagined, revealing a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. And as these women found the courage to speak out, as their voices joined mine, as their experiences formed an undeniable wall of truth, something amazing happened. People finally listened. The school board, which had initially been hesitant to acknowledge the full scope of the problem, suddenly found itself under immense pressure to do more, to investigate further, to admit that this wasn't just one isolated case, but a systemic failure that had allowed a predator to operate within their walls for years. Parents demanded accountability, demanded changes to how complaints were handled, demanded transparency about past incidents, and suddenly, the very institution that had once protected Mr. Reynolds was now working overtime to distance itself from him, to make it clear that they had no knowledge of his behavior, that they had never ignored any warnings. But they had ignored the warnings, had dismissed the concerns, had allowed a man like him to thrive because it was easier to believe that a trusted educator couldn't possibly be capable of something so vile. And now, with the truth out in the open, with parents furious and the community demanding action, the school had no choice but to act like they cared, had no choice but to scramble to clean up the mess, had no choice but to face the reality that they had failed. Meanwhile, Mr. Reynolds' world continued to fall apart, his reputation destroyed, his name dragged through the mud, his carefully crafted illusion of respectability shattered beyond repair. He had once believed that no one would believe me, that he could punish me for rejecting him, that he could hurt my son without consequence. But now he was the one suffering the consequences. Now he was the one no one believed. Now he was the one whose name would forever be associated with disgrace. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally felt like justice was being served. The school board officially cleared my son's grades after conducting a thorough review of his work, finally acknowledging that he had been unfairly marked down, finally admitting that he had been deliberately sabotaged by a man who had no right to be in a position of power. They reevaluated every assignment, analyzed every test, and came to the conclusion that he had earned the grades he should have received all along, that his so-called failures had been nothing more than a calculated punishment designed to hurt him for something that had absolutely nothing to do with his abilities as a student. When they sent the final report home, I sat with him at the kitchen table, watching as his eyes widened in disbelief, as he slowly realized that he had won, that everything he had worked so hard for had not been in vain, that despite the unfairness of what had been done to him, justice had finally found its way to him. He passed with flying colors, just as he should have from the beginning, just as he would have if not for the cruel games of a bitter man who thought he could control everything. I watched as relief washed over him, watched as the stress he had been carrying for months seemed to lift from his small shoulders, watched as he finally allowed himself to believe that he wasn't the problem, that he had never been the problem, that everything he had been put through had never been about his intelligence or his work ethic, but about something so much more sinister. He had been just a pawn in a game he had never even known he was playing, a child caught in the crossfire of an adult's ego, but now, for the first time, he could move forward without the weight of unfairness pressing down on him. One day, as we sat together on the porch, the evening air cooling around us, he turned to me with an expression that was far too serious for a boy his age, his brows furrowed in quiet contemplation. "Mom," he asked hesitantly, his voice small but steady, "why did Mr. Reynolds do that to me?" My heart clenched at the innocence in his question, at the way he was trying to make sense of something that even grown adults struggled to understand, at the way he was searching for a reason that would make it all make sense. I looked at him, knowing he was too young to fully grasp the depths of the truth, knowing that the full explanation, the manipulation, the coercion, the abuse of power, was something I would have to explain when he was older, when he was ready to hear it. For now, I simply took his hand in mine and squeezed it gently. "Because some people think they can get away with anything," I said softly, my voice firm but comforting, "but they're wrong." The last I heard, Mr. Reynolds had lost his teaching license permanently, stripped of the career he had once used as a weapon against those who dared to challenge him, forced to face the reality that his time in the classroom had come to a humiliating end. The investigation into his conduct had expanded far beyond my initial complaint, uncovering years of unethical behavior, uncovering patterns of manipulation that had long been ignored, exposing a man who had spent far too much time believing he was untouchable. It turned out that I was not the first mother he had tried to intimidate, not the first parent who had raised concerns, not the first person to question his methods, but I was the first who had refused to back down, the first who had fought with undeniable proof, the first who had finally shattered the illusion of power he had so carefully crafted around himself. As word spread through the community, more families came forward, more parents stepped up, more voices joined together in a chorus of outrage, demanding accountability, demanding that the school district take responsibility for allowing a man like him to remain in his position for so long. The lawsuit against him grew larger with each passing week, with multiple families filing complaints, seeking justice for the harm he had caused, determined to make sure that he would never have the opportunity to hold authority over a child again. His once pristine reputation, the one he had clung to so desperately, the one that had protected him for years, was now nothing more than a pile of ashes, burned away by the truth he had tried so hard to suppress. He had once been so sure that no one would believe me, so sure that his word would always be taken over mine, so sure that he could twist reality in his favor, but now he was the one no one believed, the one people whispered about in disgust, the one who could no longer hide behind a respectable title. No one trusted him, no one defended him, no one wanted to be associated with the man who had built his power on fear and manipulation. And in the end, it wasn't me who destroyed him, wasn't my son, wasn't even the school board. It was his own arrogance, his own inability to recognize that eventually, all lies come to light. As I watched my son walk across the stage at his graduation years later, his shoulders squared with confidence, his eyes bright with a kind of determination that no one had been able to take from him, I felt something settle inside me, something that had taken years to fully understand. Justice isn't just about punishment. Justice isn't just about making the guilty suffer, isn't just about tearing down the ones who tried to hurt you, isn't just about watching someone like Mr. Reynolds lose everything he once thought he could never be stripped of. Justice is about ensuring that the right people win, that the ones who are wronged are the ones who walk away stronger, that the ones who were nearly broken by cruelty and abuse rise higher than those who tried to bring them down. As the crowd erupted into applause, as my son accepted his diploma with a smile that radiated pride, I realized that no amount of punishment for Mr. Reynolds could ever compare to this moment. No amount of consequences for him could ever be as satisfying as seeing my son thrive despite what had been done to him. Mr. Reynolds had tried to make him a victim, had tried to steal his success, had tried to break his spirit, but he had failed. My son had walked away from it all stronger, knowing that he had a mother who would fight for him, knowing that no one, not even a man who once held all the power, could dictate what he was capable of achieving. As my son stepped off the stage, his eyes searching the crowd until they met mine, I felt the overwhelming weight of everything we had endured together. The fear, the anger, the fight for justice, all fade into something else entirely. Because we had won. We had stood against a man who thought he was invincible. We had refused to back down when the odds were stacked against us, and in the end, we had proven him wrong. My son had his future, I had my peace, and the man who had once believed he could destroy us had been reduced to nothing more than a bad memory. And in that moment, as I stood to cheer for the boy who had become a man despite it all, I knew with absolute certainty that we had already won.